I am so excited to meet another international school educator. This time, Joanna Kolota is coming all the way across the pond from the United Kingdom. There are a lot of listeners in the UK, by the way. And today she's going to be sharing her book called Empowering EAL Learners in Secondary Schools. If you do not know what EAL is, it's usually an international school, but it's called English as an Additional Language. The subtitle for the book is A Practical Resource to Support the Language Development of Multilingual Learners. You had me at Empowering EAL and Secondary Schools. Joanna, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam, for having me. It's an honor.
Can you give us a little bit of your context?
Yeah, of course. So I've worked in a variety of contexts for the last 15 years. And when I mean a variety of contexts, I mean I've worked in primary schools all the way to tertiary education where I worked with postgraduate students at one of the university here in England, preparing them for their postgraduate courses, so international students. I've also worked with adults and college students, so post-16. But for the vast majority of my professional life, I've worked in inner city secondary schools, so students aged between 11 to 16. So these secondary mainstream schools in England. And currently I work as a curriculum leader for multilingual learners in a brand new secondary school in Leeds. We opened 3 years ago. We are an extremely diverse school, both culturally and linguistically. So at the moment on roll, we have 720 students, but like I mentioned, we are a new school, so we are still growing. And 70% of our students are students who are classed as EAL learners. So these are students who do speak or understand languages other than English. And very often it's not just one language, but sometimes 2, 3, or even more. And there are over 50 languages and dialects represented in my school. So although the main language of instruction is English, and we are a state school, we are proud to say that actually we are multilingual because we have so many languages, so many cultures, so many backgrounds represented in our school. So in my day-to-day job, I oversee the provision for those students, and I very often collaborate with teachers, and what we are doing, or what we've been doing from day one, is ensuring that we have very sustainable infrastructure to support all multilingual learners in our school, because we have students who are advanced bilingual learners, but at the same time we have new starters who might be new to English, sometimes new to education or with some disruptive education. So in my role, I oversee the provision for multilingual learners, overseeing admissions meetings, making sure that we have a strong induction program for those students who are new to the school. But for the vast majority of my time, I work with teachers, collaborate, making sure that the instruction is accessible to every single student in mainstream classrooms. So being as inclusive as possible, that's the main goal.
You talked about infrastructure. Can we get to talk about that? What does that look like?
So I think very often what happens, and I wouldn't like to speak for every single school, but obviously every school is a little bit different context. But what often happens, unfortunately, support for multilingual learners, or at least for EAL learners in some schools, is not well established, or it's rather an initiative, and it's not part of very sustainable infrastructure. And an initiative is something that very often is introduced and it's encouraged to be used and implemented, but then kind of it fades away and teachers forget about it. Maybe it's not the main focus. So given the number of the students, multilingual learners in my school, we knew that from the very first day, we need to establish something that is sustainable. And for example, if somebody leaves, if the teachers change, if we suddenly have more students joining us, and the situation in the world is very volatile. So I know some schools had loads of students from Ukraine or Hong Kong. We have a lot of asylum seekers, and we must be ready. And being ready means that there are certain systems in place that work all the time, not only on certain days. So we've been building that infrastructure, meaning that all the teachers are supported in terms of developing their expertise, and therefore the students are supported. And if every single teacher is able to help an EAL learner, regardless of the English proficiency levels, then we know we are doing something right, because we are very consistent. And that particular child receives the same quality education, whether it's a geography class, whether it's a science class, whether it's history class. So we don't want to create different experiences just, down the corridor. And you might have a fantastic science lesson where a newcomer is supported and suddenly they go to geography and it's a wasted hour of their time. So that's what I mean by building that sustainable infrastructure. Every single teacher on the same page, high quality expertise, and that expertise is being developed and is very agile.
The magic of infrastructure, systematically, intentionally building infrastructure, is that it's a systematic, that it's not teacher lottery. It's like, oh my goodness, I got this teacher, so this year I'm going to have a good year. Or this one class, a science class, I'm going to have a bad year because I didn't get the teacher science lottery, right? And so what does that look like? What does that like? So you support your colleagues and your other EAL colleagues. So how do you support them and their content teachers?
So my role, I guess, and the role of a language specialist is very multifaceted. So that infrastructure obviously is built of sort of smaller parts, and it starts with a very strong induction program. So we have quite a few new students joining us throughout the year. So we have students leaving and students joining us mid-year. So part of it is having that strong induction program where students learn more about how our school works, how an English school works. So they are not simply just thrown into mainstream lessons, but they know exactly what the routines are, what is expected from them, and they learn the language of our school because it is quite specific. Then moving on to supporting teachers. As a language specialist, I have a protected time where every other week I meet with a representative of a department. And the important thing is, and it's worth stressing, that it comes from the top. So the head, the principal of the school is very supportive of that system. So a teacher from each department is given an extra time. This is calendared. This is not a meeting that happens on the corridor, or in the canteen. We do have time to meet, sit down and discuss whatever needs discussing. And sometimes it's a very strategic point. Sometimes it's looking at the assessment and how we can adapt maybe the assessment for students who are new to English, looking at how we can modify resources, how we can adapt. It could be simply discussing a group of new students who have joined us recently and maybe they do not make as much progress as we want them to. So that's one part of the job I do, but also we, as a school, we are very strong on developing teachers' expertise. So we've partnered with loads of different organizations who help us deliver training, but I also deliver training in-house. And I guess the book that I wrote was kind of the outcome of what I know and what I've got to know throughout the years. And it's not my job necessarily that is in the book, but it's the what I do and what we do as a school. And certainly my colleagues have contributed to the book because they let me work with them, I guess. And it's so important that both language and content are represented and intertwined, because we must never separate them. And that's why what works, that's why it works.
We'll get to your book in a second, but I do want to say I wrote down the way the infrastructure works. The magic is that it has admin support, and admin support is manifested through the way they protect or create the co-planning time, or create time in the schedule for content teachers and language specialists who work together. That might be co-planning time, that might be co-teaching time, that might be both co-planning and co-teaching time. But the culture is set that at this school, we support multilingual learners by collaborating together. And so that's the beauty of your structure, and that happens through an admin.
Yeah. Absolutely. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked.
Right,
And it sends the message that the support for multilingual learners is important. It's not an add-on. It's not an afterthought. It's
right,
not something that happens in the margins.
right,
It's pretty much, in the center of
right,
what we do.
right. You talked about inclusion. So your language specialists don't pull the secondary students out of science classes or math classes, right? What do they do?
And so I always say that it's not either or, it's not a dichotomy that all students have to be in lessons or these students have to be out of lessons. So when we started, we very much supported students in mainstream classes. So the students have not been taken out. Now, we've noticed that some students who are new to English sometimes do struggle in mainstream lessons, even though the resources are appropriately modified, the teachers know about the English proficiency levels, and they do have high level of expertise. So at the moment, there is a very small group of students who work with a language specialist outside of the mainstream class. But when I say outside, is just they are physically outside. But what they do within that hour is actually the same work that happens in the mainstream classroom. So again, that collaboration between a language specialist and a content specialist is very close. Students know why they are out, why they work with a language specialist during that 1 hour, and it's an hour or two per week. So it's not that they miss a lot of classes. And what happens is during that hour or a couple of hours, a language specialist is able to scaffold appropriately even more. So the students who is new to English, when they are back in mainstream classrooms, they know exactly what's happened. They've got the same knowledge, they've got the same content, but they've got the chance to rehearse a little bit more. They have a chance for more kind of explicit teaching, and they feel empowered and they feel much more confident knowing that they haven't missed anything, but they've practiced the language and they've practiced the content in sort of a safer space. And sometimes it's just one-to-one, sometimes two students, one teacher. But I think it's important that the students know what happens, why it happens. And we've had very positive feedback from students that they appreciate the support, and they know it's not because the teacher cannot support them, it's because we know how to support them even more effectively.
Right, right. I like that concept of giving students more time to rehearse the content. When do they start going back into the classes, or what does this look like? Take a student in particular who is being pulled out to do those things, and when do they come back, and how often in a week, I guess.
So there are 2 or 3 lessons maximum that the students leave, and the intervention, we don't call them interventions, we call them language support classes, because again, that idea of intervening with language is something that we try not to advocate for.
Right,
But we have very specific goals of what the students or what we would like a student to achieve within, let's say, a term, which is usually 6 weeks.
right,
And we know that language development, language acquisition is a long, lengthy process, and it's a complex process. It's not linear, so we won't get from A to B, in a very straight line. So we review the progress usually after 6 weeks, and then the students go back to lessons. And if they need more support, we'll look at it further down the line. But we have very specific goals that we would like students to achieve, and they are very attainable. So it could be simply just, for students who are new to English, is to be able to write a sentence that is grammatically correct,
right,
that follows the right word order.
right,
Once they've achieved that, they go back to lessons. We monitor their progress, but we know that they should be in mainstream lessons because that's where the expert teachers are.
right,
That's where the content teachers are.
right. And that's where the opportunity to use language in context live.
Absolutely.
Um, so you said they leave for 3 classes. What classes do they leave for?
Again, it's very personalized and very bespoke. So we look at students' data, we looked at the progress, we look at the outcomes, and usually after the assessment, we have a look at what classes do they struggle in. And usually, and probably you're not going to be surprised, these are the lessons which are very language heavy, such as history, complex text, very often science, sometimes English as well, where they have to read lengthy text full of very difficult vocabulary. But what happens during those sessions, very often we use resources in their first languages if they are literate in that first language. So although I said it's 6 weeks, it could be fewer weeks than that. It's just whatever works for a particular student. And since we are still quite a small school in terms of numbers, because we haven't reached the capacity yet, we feel that we can be very agile and responsive. Obviously, the team of language specialists grows, so next year we might have more teachers supporting more students. But I think it's always very difficult to predict because, like I've mentioned, we have students joining us at different times throughout the year. And the majority of the students who do join us are multilingual, but very often advanced bilingual learners. So although they do still require some support, particularly in terms of adapting to a kind of new culture, or maybe not necessarily adapting, maybe that's not the great word, learning more about the culture and the educational system, then obviously they require different support than a student who is new to English.
So we just spent like the last 10, 15 minutes talking about the infrastructure, then getting close to newcomers. And now let's transition to the more advanced multilinguals or students who have more proficiency. What do those students do in your infrastructure?
So like I mentioned, we try for all students to be in mainstream classes. We feel that that's where they belong, that's where they should be, because academically they will develop in mainstream classes, but also we are trying to be as inclusive as possible. And students are in mainstream classes because that's where the purposeful learning happens, where they develop both the language and the content. So I am quite confident to say that all our teachers are quite well versed at supporting multilingual learners. And what happens in a geography classroom, I can assure you happens in a science classroom. So, for example, explicit vocabulary teaching. And actually, although the book I wrote is divided into chapters and sort of skills, obviously we want to approach language more holistically, but vocabulary teaching, explicit vocabulary teaching in all classrooms is something that happens every single lesson. So a teacher will identify a word or two, or maybe 3 words maximum, that will be taught explicitly. And we very often refer to the seminal work of tiered vocabulary 1, 2, and 3. So our teachers are fully aware of vocabulary that needs to be introduced in lessons, but also they know that a lot of learning happens through just being simply exposed to certain vocabulary and certain words. And that language that is present in mainstream classrooms is something that develops students not only vocabulary but generally language. So that consistency of supporting multilingual learners, advanced multilingual learners, is there in every single lesson. The other thing that is really crucial is reading and high quality texts. So we don't shy away from introducing high quality text and therefore very often linguistically challenging texts in our lessons, because when students sit their final exams, these are the type of text they will be exposed to. So we cannot and we mustn't sort of protect them from texts that are too complex, because actually later on it's going to be even more difficult to introduce those high quality challenging texts when they are about to sit their exams. So it's all about being very responsive, adaptive, and very proactive. And we mustn't forget that we have 5 years. When the students join us in year 7, we still have 5 years. And I think a lot of teachers, especially if there is a student who is new to English, they feel that that student needs to start speaking, in full sentences straight away, or they have to read high quality text in 2 weeks or a month. And I feel that pressure and I understand it. But at the same time, I always say, no, it's a process. Let's just pause and look at the progress they've already made. Look how great the progress looks. And it's not your sort of job to teach that students English. You as if just one person, is the whole school's job to teach the students English. Right. And when we work together, when we have certain systems in place, then we will see huge progress.
Right. It's almost like when I tell teachers the like we're all in it together. I tell teachers that we are on a plot of land and we are construction workers, and we are, each of us is carrying a brick and we're adding to that foundation and we're building on each other. Your brick might look different than mine, or you're going to be adding to a different part of that foundation, but we're all going to be building together. Every single time the student is in your room, they're adding, you're giving them opportunities to add bricks to the foundation, add columns to their language in the development. That's
I
how
love that
language
analogy.
develops.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true.
So we kind of jumped into your book already, but let's go back to like the formal questions of like, what was the seed of this book? Every book has a seed. Every book has a service, a need they're trying to service. What was the seed and the need you're trying to service through this book, Joanna?
I think just as much that I can talk about the seed for this book, I think it's also important for me to talk about the conditions thanks to which that seed could actually grow. Because I think that, once you've been teaching for quite a while, I guess you think as a teacher, you might say, well, I've got loads of resources, I've got a lot of experience. Surely this enough maybe to write a book, but that imposter syndrome kicks in and you think, well, who am I to actually think about writing a book. So I think because I've witnessed firsthand the challenges that the students very often face, the students who are learning English, who are new to the country, it's navigating so many layers of different language and different cultures. And obviously they are teenagers, so that's just another factor to add in its own right. So the seed for the book, I guess, was wanting to help the students. That's just the simplest and most honest truth. But at the same time, having spoken to many colleagues across the country, and I know these are just anecdotes, but there's a need in England for teachers to develop their expertise further in terms of supporting multilingual learners. And very often when I spoke to teachers, they expressed I don't know, worry, or maybe not feeling prepared fully to support multilingual learners in their classrooms. So I guess there are two different things at play. It's wanting to support students, but also wanting to support teachers. And to give you just a little bit of context, I know you have listeners all over the world. In England, it's actually the support for multilingual learners varies greatly from school to school, from local authority to local authority, because as such, there isn't a policy that, for example, tells you that those students need to be assessed. So they don't have to be assessed in terms of their English language proficiency levels. There isn't a requirement. In teacher's standard, there's literally just one line saying that each teacher should be able to support multilingual learners in their classrooms. But then they don't necessarily receive training, or the quality of the training, or how often the training happens, again, varies a lot. And actually, teachers report that one thing that the top three things that they would like to develop, and that was a survey done across the country, is supporting multilingual learners, because they do recognize that our classrooms are very much multilingual, but there isn't enough happening in terms of that support being provided. So that's the seed, but also, as I mentioned, that imposter syndrome, I don't think on my own I would have ever felt brave enough to say, oh, I'm going to write a book. So I actually spoke at one of the conferences a couple of years ago, and I was approached by a senior editor from Routledge, who clearly recognized that there is a need for that kind of a book, a very practical toolkit, if you like, for teachers to access and to learn. So I gave it a go, and here we are. 2 years later, the book is actually here in physical form.
And you wrote it during your pregnancy. So listen, if somebody could do it during their pregnancy, anybody can do it, right? So you're giving us inspiration to do that. So let's dive into the vocabulary level of instruction. You touched on it, but what does that specifically look like? Let's move to one of the classes, give it an example from one of the classes, and what does vocabulary look like in that class?
So yes, I've mentioned the tier 1, 2, and 3 vocabulary, although I always say that every single word is important, even more so for a multilingual learner, because we don't always know what that learner knows and what they don't know. And actually, in my book, I give an example of a science lesson where the teacher was explaining a concept of gravity, and he said something like, if you take a pebble and if you throw the pebble, and then he explained the rules of gravity, and actually a student put a hand up and said, "Sir, what's a pebble?" So never mind, the gravity and all the laws and the vocabulary associated with it. For her, the word pebble stood out because she didn't know that word. And very often we assume as teachers that students will know this word because this is a tier 1 vocabulary. I mentioned our 5-step process of introducing tier 2 vocabulary. So these are the academic words. So in every single classroom, a teacher will identify 2 or 3 words prior to the lesson, and the words will be introduced in a very explicit way where the students will have a chance to practice saying the word out loud, using it in a sentence in a variety of contexts, but also then moving to that main context that is particular to that specific lesson. They will also practice writing the words and use the word in a sentence on a mini whiteboard. They will have a chance to rehearse it, and that happens in every single lesson. But purely by exposing students to reading, to high quality text, they do learn a lot of new words. We also try to be very proactive and, for example, create glossaries and visual dictionaries in the margin of our booklets so the students can have sort of like a quick glossary and a dictionary that is available to them straight away. But we ensure that students have a chance to practice and use that vocabulary, because obviously just being exposed to vocabulary is one thing, but also having very meaningful, controlled scenarios, but meaningful and authentic scenarios when they can use that word is very, very important.
That sounds like you're referencing Beck et al.'s work from Bringing Words to
Yes.
Life. Can you give us an
Mhm.
example of one of those words and how teachers would start with? Give us an example of what that instruction looks like.
So the teacher will always start with presenting the word on the board.
Can you give
And
us
we
an
use,
example of a word, like just hypothetically go through the practice?
yeah, so it could be, I don't know, the word reaction. I don't know if it's react, reaction. And also our students know that meta language, because it's introduced in English, so they will know react is a verb and reaction. Have a look, it's a noun, and notice the ending. And they also, we focus a lot on morphology and very often etymology of the words. So they are sort of skilled at recognizing the ending of the words, and they know this is going to be a process or this is going to be a noun because I can see that ending. We use choral repetition as well. So the teacher will model the pronunciation of the word and will say, I say, you say. And it's quite powerful because you don't single students out, so everybody has a chance to say the word. And I know the word reaction might not be the most difficult one, but then you get to photosynthesis and all the words where the students, feel more confident when everybody says the word. Later, that word is used in a sentence. And it could be a sentence that is not necessarily straight away related to the lesson. So, for example, how did you react when you notice something? And let's have a look at what it means to react in this particular context of a science lesson. We also use mini whiteboards, so the students have a chance to practice first orally an example of how would you react if, or have a look at this specific element. How do you think this element will react when we combine it with something else? Discuss it with your partner. Again, very low stakes because it's pair work. It's, students feel confident talking to one another. And then we reinforce that vocabulary, but also make sure that students can spell it and use it in a sentence. They use mini whiteboards. If they make a mistake, they can quickly wipe it off, correct it, write another sentence, and the teacher can scan the room to see if the students now know the word and can use it in that particular sentence.
Right. Because imagine if if the word reaction is key to that lesson and the teacher doesn't teach that, students are lost. Students can't talk about
Absolutely.
the chemical reaction or how did this substance react to that chemical. They're lost. And so when we give an opportunity, any teacher can do this. You don't have to be an EAL specialist to do this. You simply teach the word reaction by giving students non-content based opportunities. Like, how did you
Mhm.
react to the storm last night? Right. And then
Absolutely.
let me show you a reaction between baking soda and vinegar. I want you to describe the reaction. Now we're going to do experiments where you're going to be looking at different substances and describing their reactions. Boom, done. Right. And so,
Absolutely. It you might argue that, well, it takes some time in the lesson to introduce a single word, but at the same time it will pay dividends later on. You will see the benefits of it. And also, as a teacher, if you just spend literally a few minutes just scanning through your lesson and identifying those 2 or 3 words that are important, and you're going to spend some time um, teaching the words explicitly in your lessons, the students will remember them rather than just mentioning the word moving on, and two lessons later
right,
still they've no idea what the particular word is.
right,
So I think it's so important, that preparation on teachers' part, and
right,
it takes only a few minutes, really.
right. And I want to add to what you're saying is when they look for the 2 or 3 words they want to teach explicitly in that lesson, the lens is what words will establish comprehensible input for students in that lesson. Without comprehensible input, there's no output because they'll use the
Absolutely.
word reaction in the future as an output, but they can't use it in the output if they don't understand it in the input. So that's the link there. Let's
Yeah.
move to developing students' reading skills. You kind of talked about that and not having students read quote unquote watered down uh, text. So what do we do?
I think reading, that's the topic that probably you can make a whole new podcast about, because there are so many opinions and evidence, and loads of things that people talk about reading. But essentially reading needs to happen in mainstream classrooms, and yes, students need to be able to decode the words. So phonics, it's important, um, but we need to move beyond phonics. And in our school we actually have a teacher of reading, a person who is purely there to help students develop their reading skills. And it starts for some students will need phonics work, but some students will need sort of higher level comprehension. But what is important when it comes to developing multilingual learners' reading skills, and any students' reading skills, that skill doesn't happen in a vacuum. So again and again, I'm going to stress they need to be in mainstream lessons. They need to start building up that background knowledge to be able then to understand what is being read in mainstream classrooms. Um, in my school, we use booklets, so we don't use sort of pieces of paper or worksheets that are printed every single lesson, but a booklet is put by a team of specialists in our school, so they know exactly what is going to be taught each lesson. Students are provided with their own booklet, and we try to preempt and come up with certain strategies that will help students access the reading. So I've already mentioned the glossaries and the vocabulary in the margin, but also then we are very intensive when it comes to the tasks that follow. So we don't want just students to read a text and then answer comprehension questions, because usually what happens, some students are really good at answering those questions without actually knowing what the text is about, because usually the first question and the answer to the first question is at the top of the text. The second question is probably few lines further down. So we are thinking about what sort of tasks will make students think about the text. And it could be simply if we are reading Romeo and Juliet, for example. If we are reading, let's say, a short summary of Romeo and Juliet, it's simply asking maybe students to plot the relationship between the characters. So the students have to refer to the text, they have to populate a diagram, and then you've got your tasks pretty much activity ready for, okay, can you tell your partner who's who in the play? So they refer to the text, they refer to the diagram, they practice their speaking skills, and then depending on the time and then the objective of the lesson, can you now please write the sentences down? So just having one text, you can actually practice all skills together simultaneously, and it's not a sort of very lengthy and onerous preparation on the teacher's part. And I think that's what the book presents. It gives you tasks that do not take a lot of time, and it's not about creating sort of layered, differentiated worksheets. It's what all students can do with a certain level of scaffolding in your lessons.
So tell me, I'm hearing listeners saying, oh, tell me more about the booklets. So how do teachers, content teachers, decide what text to use? And then how does the EO, this language specialist, like collaborate on that? Like, how do they do? You said every single lesson they have a different passage, or like, how does that give us the logistics behind that?
Booklets are used quite often in English schools these days, and there are loads of benefits of using booklets because, firstly, as a teacher, you don't have to scramble for resources every single lesson. Everything is ready for you, and a lot of time goes into preparing those booklets. So, as a subject specialist, a teacher will know that this is what's going to be important, and this is what's going to be what we are going to study in science and geography, or English. So they focus on content. But then what happens before the actual booklets are printed, we meet together. So I would meet with a science teacher or a geography teacher, and we would sit together and have a look at how certain tasks can be scaffolded for students. And we know that in this particular class, we have 5 students who are new to English. Therefore, they might have an extra level of scaffolding. And it could be simple as writing frames, sentence starters. How about we add an extra visual? How about we divide or chunk the passages? How about we introduce, give a very short summary before actually they read the text? How about we include some cultural references? So in the book, actually, you will find examples of how both literary but also non-literary text can be scaffolded. And it doesn't I think what is important when I meet with the teachers, content teachers, obviously they are specialists in terms of the content. I don't know what needs to be taught, but I can then help and advise on the language. And not every single activity has to be meticulously scaffolded, but we are focusing on what is crucial, what's important, what needs to be amplified. So it's not like we are, creating layers and layers of different booklets within the booklet. It's just really focusing on what's key and what's crucial.
I wonder, I'm thinking about listeners and their questions they'll be asking. Tell us about the timeline in which you do this. Like, is it you do all the booklets before the unit or the week before the lesson? Like, how does that, the timeline for the booklets?
So usually there is a deadline when the booklets need to be ready, because then obviously they need to be sent to printers and you have to print hundreds of booklets. So it is quite time consuming to start with, but then you don't spend as much time creating the resources later on. What you can focus on is actually how you're going to teach it. So the resources are ready, but still, obviously, as a teacher, you know your class best and you know how to teach, how to introduce that topic to students. But a lot of that hard work is done for you already. And we reuse the booklets. So, year sevens will be using the booklets from last year, but with some tweaks. So it's always an ever evolving process, because actually you taught a lesson and you thought, I'm going to include this particular thing because I hadn't last time. Or you think, actually, I don't need that scaffolding. It's okay. The students were fine. But I think, again, it's being responsive. And just because the booklets are ready, it doesn't mean that you just give the booklet to students and your job is done as a teacher. You still have to monitor the situation. You have to still check the understanding, but you don't spend a lot of time on creating resources. The resources are there and you are there as an expert to lead the classroom.
Right. And the fact that I can see this is the creating the booklets together with your colleagues is an example of really effective co-planning time together. Even if you're not able to be in that grade 7 class, the teacher has co-created or co-approved or co-constructed that booklet together. So then when they're familiar with it, so then when they're teaching that class with reaction, they're reading about reaction, you might be in a year 6 class supporting another class. Well, they're
Absolutely.
still using that book. And so this is the power of co-planning. We multiply our time. And when we're not there in the class, it's still supporting all students because I hear you printing out 100 copies and all students
Yes.
use this. And it's not just singling out the multilingual learners.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And for our multilingual learners, we do have sort of we introduce a toolkit of 5 key strategies that we want teachers to use. And it's not prescriptive, it's not exhaustive, we understand, but there are 5 strategies. And it's, as simple as, for example, introducing language functions, of if you compare and contrast, use sentence starters. And you might have it in the booklet at the bottom of the page for those students who need it. Um, but if you don't need it for that particular class, they don't have to refer to it. But
Right.
for example, if you have a new student,
Right.
they still use that same high quality booklet, but they have got the scaffolding at the bottom. So it's not suddenly juggling, thousands of different worksheets. It's all there for you.
Let's talk about how do you strike the balance between simplification and easification?
Yes. So yes, it's all about striking the balance. So the easification is making text more accessible in a nutshell, whereas simplification is simplifying and unfortunately often watering down the content. And I've mentioned the dichotomy either or. Sometimes it's really difficult to decide what to do, particularly, for example, if you do have a student who is, let's say, new to English, but also they have some gaps in education, and suddenly they are in an English class, GCSE, getting ready for the exams, and they have to study Hamlet or Macbeth, which even for a monolingual learner, a speaker of English, it's a challenging text. It's a challenging text written in an English that might not be straight away be accessible to all students, but never mind knowing the plot and the characters. Now they have to analyze um, the play. So that's a completely different level. Um, so it might be that that teacher decides that actually I'm going to simplify the language. And by that also, I think particularly when it comes to literature, it's also simplifying the content. Because I argue in the book that if you read a literary text and you take the words that are tricky and difficult and leave what's crucial, what's important, yes, it's going to help that student, but this is not the text they're going to see in their final exams. So what we want to do ideally, if we want to easify the text, so we want to use different scaffolding techniques and different activities to allow students to access the text rather than just simplify the text. And it's all about striking that balance. But I know that the teachers know the students best, and they know when it is the right time to simplify something and when it's the right time to make something easier. But at
Right.
the same time, you cannot teach photosynthesis if you take the word photosynthesis out of the lesson, because you can argue it's difficult to pronounce, it's difficult to write.
Right.
But actually, if you don't teach that word, then what's the point of teaching the lesson?
Right.
Um, so I think doing the hard work to start with is important rather than having those easy choices.
Right.
If you go for an easy choice, it
Right.
will be really difficult later on down the line. But we do recognize that some students will need extra support, and maybe they will need they will benefit from the language being simplified, but also in certain areas, maybe simplifying the content, maybe, but very cautiously. And obviously, we know that the English proficiency level is not indicative of students' cognitive ability. So just because the student is new to English, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily new to the particular concepts that we are studying.
Right. Right.
So it's that balancing act. Very
Right.
tricky, but
Right.
it needs to be done.
Right. Because I see simplification as giving students a fish and easification as teaching students to fish by giving them
Mhm.
more scaffolds inside. Your book, you call it easification. In the book that Beth and I wrote, we call it text engineering, where we're putting in this
Mhm.
we're taking the text and we're engineering it so that's more accessible. We
Yes.
that's
Mhm.
exactly in the strategies that you
That's
shared,
exactly, yes.
chunking it, adding
Mhm.
images, adding students home heritage languages, um, adding guiding questions, having students say pause here and write an annotation about what you just read in this section. These are all things that we are making the text accessible so students learn how to
Yeah.
read more challenging
Mhm.
text, because when we don't do that, we rob them of opportunities of developing the rigorous academic skills to access those texts in the future. So we might be
Mhm.
giving them a fish, but we're not teaching them how to fish on their own.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm all about analogies.
Yes.
Let's talk about our second penultimate question is about writing instruction besides vocabulary and sentence structure. Can you talk about writing instruction in content classes for secondary students?
Yes, I think writing is one of those skills that is the most challenging, the most difficult. And again, it's not necessarily just for multilingual learners, but also for monolingual learners as well. So writing is difficult, but at the same time, it's probably the most important skill because all the exams are written exams. And obviously, writing doesn't develop in isolation. So it's vocabulary, it's speaking, it's listening, it's reading. But then, when you are in the hall, sitting down in front of exam paper, it's a written exam. So we have to pay a lot of attention to writing. Um, it's exams, but also everything else. Even writing a CV and your resume, you need to be skilled at writing because the employer might not entertain sort of a error-ridden resume and CV. So you need to master the skill. Um, so in my book, I talk about teaching students at a sentence level how to write, and I think very often we forget. We want students to write long text, complex text, but I argue that actually being very explicit about a sentence is important. Um, in my school and loads of other schools in England, we used visualizers, so little cameras that project an image of what the teacher is doing on the interactive whiteboard. And it's really powerful because the students can see how the sentences are crafted in front of them. And it's not on a whiteboard, it's not on an interactive whiteboard. It's actually the exact process that the teacher is going through. They can see it on the board. So the teacher is physically holding a pen and then narrating a thought process. Okay, I'm going to be comparing two different landscapes. Hold on a second. I need to compare. What sort of words do I use if I want to compare something as opposed to maybe contrasting? So today, for example, let's say we are going to be using the word both, and the teacher will write the word both. Remember, both means the same things, and we are talking about these two different landscapes in two different countries. So it's very explicit at that sentence level writing. Um, and obviously, then we can move to longer and more complex text. In my book, for example, I introduced the idea of parallel writing. So a teacher could provide a ready-made example of a text. Let's say we compare or contrast animal and plant cells, and we focus on content, so the students know the elements of different cell, but also the teacher highlights the linguistic features. Have a look. We are going to be listing things, so I'm going to use firstly, secondly, and thirdly. We are going to be comparing, so I'm going to be using the word both. And once the students see the process, they can hear the teacher narrating the process, they understand what they need to write and how they have to write, then they can have a go at writing sort of the very same text on their own, but using different content. So that means that they do not focus necessarily as much on how to write, but they just focus on what to write. So that one level of difficulty is taken away from them also, or they've had a chance to practice it rather than focusing on what to write, how to write. It's kind of made very explicit.
I love this new approach in our field, it seems like people are moving away from just like writing instruction to making more specific on narrowing it down to writing instruction at the sentence level. This seems very much like the writing revolution, if you're familiar with that, with Judy
Yes.
Weckler's
Yeah.
work and Judith Hoffman and Natalie Wexler's work on the writing revolution, transformative. They're talking about the just writing the sentence level. Another one is about Natalia Heckman from Sidelets, and she
Yeah.
talked about writing instruction at the sentence level as well. And there's another one that just came out. There's so many, I can't, but I'm happy that people are reinforcing. In my class, I realized that writing instruction at the sentence level is the easiest and the clearest way to build academic writing structure. When we teach, because it's overwhelming to say writing is such a big task and a complicated task. But if we make it more accessible at the sentence structure, they can apply both in a different context. They can use both in more complex text in the future, or they can expand on it. It's just accessible and it's just tangible.
Yeah.
It's manageable writing instruction at the sentence level.
And I think even more so in secondary school, when you have an hour of English and you're expected to write very flowery sentences, and then suddenly you go to science and you are told to write, very short, succinct sentences. And I remember very distinctly in one of the science lessons, there was a task they had to describe the journey of the food through the digestive system. And because the word journey was used, one of the students really did write sort of like a story of how food travels through the digestive system. But the teacher didn't make it explicit. No, this we write differently in a science lesson. We write very succinctly using passive voices rather than creating, a story, a journey, how the food travels through the digestive system.
Right.
So we need to be very explicit that this is how we write in this lesson. And I know in English you just learned
Right.
all the wonderful things and the structures of wonderful sentences, but now let's shift our focus to science.
Right. I tell teachers that when I share with teachers and encourage them, whenever you notice that you are assuming something, that should be a little red flag in your mind to be like, wait, maybe I should teach the word pebble, or maybe I should show them the
Yeah,
word reaction, or maybe I should teach them the word both when they're comparing instead of assuming. And said, you don't want to assume and then assign. You want to
exactly.
explicitly
Yes.
teach, scaffold, then guide students through doing that work.
Yes, that success is definitely engineered. It doesn't just happen. A lot of things do happen, but if we just leave it to chance, then like you say, we
Right.
assume, and our assumptions might not be correct.
Right.
And it takes a minute to just point something out
Right.
and make it explicit.
Right. What we want students to produce, we have to teach explicitly. If not, we are just assigning and then assuming they get it. And of course, when they get it back, we say, why don't they get it?
Yeah.
Let's end the podcast with this. This has been so practical, Joanna. Um, I always end with red light, green light, yellow light. What is something you ask teachers to stop doing, start doing, and continue doing when working with multilinguals?
It's a very good question, but it's a very difficult one because again, I don't want to assume. I don't want to assume that everybody is at the very same stage in sort of understanding how to support multilingual learners or developing their expertise. So I'm going to give you the three things that you've asked me for, but obviously I know that people will be at different stages. So what I would say, please continue. Um, please continue to have very high expectations of every single student because students do like to be challenged, but continue to support them at the same time. Start maybe stop first. I'm going to start with the stop thing, with the red light. Stop thinking that it's your job to develop that student's language and your only job and you're the only person, but start collaborating with whoever is in your school, whether it's a language specialist or the teachers. Start collaborating, start exchanging ideas, resources, and maybe even if you have half an hour that is dedicated to multilingual learners, it might be transformative to your teaching and definitely transformative to your students.
Well, I am so happy that the person in when you did a presentation at the conference, that the person from Rutledge saw the light in your presentation and then saw the seed of the book in it. I'm so happy. And I hope that you continue to write books. When I listen to podcasts and when I host, I'm always looking for practicality. And from every single minute of the podcast, you have been very practical. I see you as a person in the classroom. Your examples are so clear and you make it so comprehensible for us. I know this will be a podcast that teachers
Thank
will listen
you.
to again and again. And I know this podcast will be paired well with the book that people will purchase that was based upon this podcast. So, Joanna Kolota, wait,
Kolota.
so Joanna
Kolota.
Kolota, thank you so much for gracing the podcast and wish you all the
Thank you
best.
very much. Thank you very much, Tan. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.